and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading it loud and clear.
Roger all, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, there, Brahma.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the February 20th, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Michael Abdillah, and I have Angelo Di Grazia and Tina Stagg here with me tonight from the Space Association of Australia. We'll start once again this week with more exciting news from Australia. The Australian Space Agency has entered into a Memorandum of Understanding with the United Arab Emirates Space Agency to facilitate closer international partnerships in their mutual space industry sectors. Australian Space Agency Deputy Head Anthony Murfitt said the Memorandum of Understanding signing was another milestone for the agency, demonstrating a commitment to fostering Australia's growth in the global space economy. This MOU is part of the Australian Space Agency's broader mission to triple the size of Australia's space sector to $12 billion a year and create up to 20,000 new jobs by 2030. The signing of the agency's fourth Memorandum of Understanding took place on the grounds of the Australian Space Agency's new home, Lot 14 in Adelaide, which will host local space industry businesses and support the growing defence industry sector. Moving on to Fleet Space Technologies. Fleet Space Technologies' Internet of Things offering has registered 1 million devices in 24 hours. Flavia Tata Nardini, CEO of the South Australian company Fleet Space Technologies, said the company's Project Galaxy offer to connect devices for US $2 a year was supported by the market. Tata Nardini announced the deal during an Internet of Things conference last week, and reservations began to come through while she was still on stage. Project Galaxy booked out within 24 hours, with 1 million devices registered and over 2 million more on the waiting list. This in itself reveals the enormous demand of low-power, cost-efficient, industrial Internet of Things, Tata Nardini said. Interest came from several Fortune 500 companies and the world's most innovative Internet of Things startups, especially in the agri-tech, mining, energy and construction sectors, which all have large, unconnected land areas to service. Close to 40% of the reservations came from the United States, with the rest of the interest spread across the world. Fleet Space Technologies launched the first of its nano-satellites in 2018 on board SpaceX, Rocket Lab and ISRO launch vehicles, and has established a tracking station an hour's drive from Adelaide in South Australia. The company is now preparing to launch an additional 10 satellites by the beginning of 2020 to meet the demand, joining the 50 million devices in 100 countries already online as of 2018. Tina.
Thanks, Michael, and good evening, space fans. In some very exciting news, NASA has announced plans to land astronauts on the moon in 2028 using commercial vehicles. This time when we go to the moon, we're going to stay, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine told a room of space industry representatives last week. We're going to go sustainably, to stay, with landers and robots and rovers and humans, he said. The announcement at NASA's headquarters came just a week after the agency called on commercial space companies to submit ideas for lunar landers, tug-like transfer vehicles, and refuelling systems to keep those vehicles fueled for reuse. Interested companies have until March 25 to submit their ideas, with NASA aiming to make selections in May and issue contracts of up to $9 million for follow-up studies in July. NASA's renewed push to the moon comes from Space Policy Directive 1, an executive order signed by President Donald Trump in December of last year, directing NASA to return astronauts to the moon in a sustainable way. There are three main phases for NASA's return to the moon with astronauts. The first phase begins in 2024 when NASA aims to launch a lander descent module to its Gateway station on a commercial rocket for an uncrewed test landing demonstration on the lunar surface. The descent vehicle at this stage will not be reusable. In 2026, NASA plans a full-up uncrewed lunar landing on the Moon. The test would use a tug-like transfer vehicle to move to low lunar orbit from the Gateway station and then land. The lander's ascent element would return to orbit and be ferried back to the Gateway by the tug. In 2028, NASA will send 4 astronauts to the Moon for a lunar landing from the Gateway, supported by refueling spacecraft. The lunar ascent and transfer vehicles will be reusable. Astronauts would stay on the Moon for up to a week at a time. If this plan is realised, the Space Agency could have humans back on the Moon about 1 year before the 60th anniversary of the historic Apollo 11 moon landing. And in NASA commercial crew news, a revised schedule of Soyuz missions could give NASA more time to certify commercial crew vehicles. A Russian industry source claims NASA and Roscosmos are planning to stretch out 2 upcoming missions to the International Space Station. Astronauts Nick Hague and Drew Morgan would spend 9 months each on the station instead of the usual 6. The plan would ensure there was at least one NASA astronaut on the ISS through to April 2020, about 3 to 4 months longer than previous plans. The revised schedule would provide breathing room for commercial crew test flights, which are scheduled for the northern summer but widely expected to slip to later this year. Meanwhile, NASA is set to buy more Soyuz seats to ensure uninterrupted access to the station. NASA is considering buying 2 extra seats on Soyuz spacecraft to ensure a continued American presence on the International Space Station, amid worries about further delays in commercial crew flights. In a pre-solicitation notice filed last week, NASA announced it was considering contracting with the Russian state space corporation Roscosmos for 2 Soyuz seats, one on a mission launching in the northern autumn of 2019 and the other in the northern spring of 2020. The additional seats would ensure that NASA astronauts can remain on the station after the end of this year, when NASA's current access to Soyuz seats runs out, through to September 2020. NASA originally planned to have commercial crew vehicles under development by Boeing and SpaceX certified by the end of 2017. But both companies experienced significant delays, and neither company has flown their vehicles on uncrewed test flights, let alone those with astronauts on board. SpaceX is scheduled to launch its Crew Dragon spacecraft on an uncrewed test flight no earlier than March 2. And over to Angelo.
Okay, let's talk about NASA's Space Launch System news. NASA performed the first test of an RS-25 engine for its Space Launch System last week since an aborted test in December last year. The engine test at the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi throttled the RS-25, a shuttle heritage engine, to 113% of its rated thrust. The main objective of last week's tests were acceptance testing of the flight controller and testing of the flight controller up to a power level of 113%. The test, which had a duration of 500 seconds, was the first since December, when an RS-25 engine was shut down after just 30 seconds. NASA said the abort was caused by a problem with a non-flight test pressure transducer mounted near the engine that was removed and not needed for this latest test. NASA's Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket to be built to date, will be powered by 4 RS-25 Space Shuttle engines firing simultaneously. Will be a sight to see. Now to NASA Planetary. NASA InSight Mars lander has placed a mole on the planet's surface. The mole is part of a heat flow instrument that will burrow several metres into the surface. It will take about 2 months for the mole to reach its final depth below the surface. InSight's other main instrument, a seismometer, is already in place on the surface nearby. The Kuiper Belt object encountered by New Horizons is looking less like a snowman and more like a pancake. New images returned by the spacecraft of its flyby of 20145 MU69, nicknamed Ultima Thule, shows that the object is flatter than previously thought. Initial images appeared to show the object to be two roughly spherical bodies connected by a neck region resembling a snowman. Those two bodies are much flatter than first thought, puzzling scientists. We've never seen something like this orbiting the sun, said Alan Stern, the mission's principal investigator. Okay, let's go back to the USA and SpaceX. SpaceX has filed a protest of a NASA launch contract awarded to United Launch Alliance last month. SpaceX filed the protest with the US Government Accounting Office last week regarding NASA's selection of ULA's Atlas V to launch the Lucy planetary science mission. SpaceX said in a statement that it offered a price dramatically lower than the award amount of nearly $150 million, hence the protest. NASA's selection of the Atlas V emphasised its schedule assurance since Lucy has a narrow launch window to carry out its mission. NASA has stopped work on the contract with ULA while the GAO reviews the protest with a decision expected by May 22nd. SpaceX achieved another milestone in the testing of its Raptor engine. CEO Elon Musk said last week the latest test of the flight version of the Raptor engine reached a chamber pressure of 268.9 bar, breaking a record set by the Russian RD-180 engine, which we know powers the ULA's Atlas V rocket. The engine is designed to run at a chamber pressure of up to 300 bar, but only 250 bar is needed for normal operation of the company's next-generation Super Heavy and Starship space vehicles. Moving on to some more commercial news, Stratolaunch. Stratolaunch has received an FAA experimental certificate for test flights of its massive aeroplane. The certificate covers a series of envelope expansion test flights with an expected 15 flights spanning 40 hours. The company has not announced when those test flights will begin, although it completed what appeared to be the final taxi test of the plane last month at the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California. The company developed the plane to serve as an air launch platform, but terminated plans to develop its own launch vehicles to be deployed from it after the death of Stratolaunch's founder and principal financier, Paul Allen. This leaves the company with only the existing Pegasus XL rocket from Northrop Grumman as a customer, causing many commentators to speculate that the giant aeroplane will be sold off once it is flight proven. Right, Tina.
And in Mars One news, the for-profit arm of Mars One, the venture that plans to send people on a one-way missions to Mars, has gone bankrupt. Mars One Ventures AG was liquidated in a Swiss court last month, according to a filing that surfaced last week. The company had the exclusive rights to monetise the Mars One project and provide a share of those revenues to the Mars One Foundation, the non-profit organisation responsible for carrying out the Mars missions. Mars One founder Baz Lansdorp confirmed the company had gone bankrupt and said the foundation was working with bankruptcy administrator and an unnamed potential advisor to find a solution. Mars One and its new investor will be holding a press conference on the 6th of March, which will probably be the 7th for those of us here in Australia, to announce new information on current activities and the road ahead. Mars One has shown little public progress on its plans in recent years, postponing phases of its astronaut selection process and delaying robotic precursor missions, resulting in the overall venture being treated with scepticism by the mainstream space community.
And finally, a documentary about the Apollo 11 lunar landing mission is coming to the big screen. The film, entitled Apollo 11, will debut at IMAX theatres in the US on March the 1st for a one-week limited engagement. That will be followed by a general theatrical release across North America, with other territories to follow. The documentary features previously unreleased 70mm footage and audio about the mission discovered at the National Archives during planning for the film, commissioned and produced by CNN Films. Now, look out for Apollo 11 in Australia. the Space Association, is planning a film event in association with the Sun Theatre's Moon Festival to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first lunar landing in July of this year. So look out for that one. Okay, well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Tina and Angelo, and it's back to you, Andrew.